Planet Institute.
Welcome to R&D Unplugged, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute dedicated to discussing with researchers on the impact of their work in a simple way. My name is Shahab Nastar, and I'm your host today. Today's guest is Pedro Ramazzotti Morales. Hi, Pedro.
Hi.
Pedro, you're a researcher affiliated to the CNRS, Sciences Po Paris, as well as the Learning Planet Institute. Your research, Pedro, is about social media, algorithms, and politics. But let me start by asking this completely different question. If your research had a theme song, what would it be?
So my research is about using new data, so specifically social media data, to understand transformation in politics, but also this new digital ecosystems themselves. So I think this points to two kinds of things, right? So one is transformations that we've seen taking place since the 90s and early 2000s with disaffection with politics, globalization in politics, and on the other side, the role of new forms of alienations linked to these digital environments. And I think that one song that is a lesser-known song from a very well-known album, OK Computer, that it's called Electioneering, kind of touches these two notes, right? So it talks about a world of absurd politics linked with internationalization, but also these new forms of alienation bring about by this new technology. So
OK
maybe
Computer
this is a good
by
song.
Radiohead, right?
Yeah.
Excellent album.
Yeah, it's very well known. But this song is very a lesser known one, I think.
So let's get into the heart of the segment. You told us a little bit about your research, but what inspired you to pursue this particular research topic, Pedro?
Yeah, so it was a long detour. Like a lot of young students, I was interested in knowledge and kind of understanding the world. And at the time when I was 18, this was engineering and physics, right? So the mysteries of the universe. So actually my first internship was in an astronomical observatory in the desert. But then as I studied more and more, it became kind of clear that the mysteries were inside people's head, right? So I was interested in mathematics and logic, which is ultimately what I did my thesis on. But then it turned out that it was not only about what's inside people's head, but how people communicated together. So I took an opportunity to, and here I started a detour from mathematics to computer science to study large social systems online and algorithms. And then I went on to do a postdoc in a political science department and a sociology lab. And today I'm kind of doing research on all of these fields, so from mathematics and computer science to sociology and political science.
Yeah, so a very interdisciplinary research, which is the DNA of the Learning Planet Institute in particular. But how does your research, Pedro, contribute to the issues that the world is facing?
As I mentioned, there are two main things I'm looking at. So one is the transformation going on in politics. So we all have this feeling that something happening in the 1990s and early 2000s. So politics changed, the lines of divide change across the world. But it also comes with an entanglement with what's going on online. So the way in which we're communicating, the way in which we read news, the way in which we feel the political environment has changed too, a lot. So our research in my team, what we're trying to do are several things related to these two, but I would say that one thing that we do is we use this kind of new data from social media to try to provide new measures to understand these transformations in politics. Then we do also a lot of research on what's going on these online platforms themselves. This is very linked to, for example, platform and AI regulation. This is recent regulation that it's unfolding all around the world, for example, in the European Union, with the Digital Service Act and the AI Act. And a third kind of contribution that I think we do is we do quite a lot of development of methods and software for communities and researchers and journalists to try to get a hold on this data, right?
Very good. Let's get to the core of your research and try to understand it a little bit better. What is the main purpose or objective of your research?
We are kind of around a question that a lot of people are asking, which is what is the role of these social media platforms on the phenomena which we are concerned about when talking about them. So we're talking about segregation, polarization and what's the role of these platforms and the algorithms that are mediating, right? So everything you see, it's curated and selected by an algorithm. So we do a lot of analysis of data, trying to understand at large scale what are the consequences and the impact of these algorithms. For that, we do a lot of what's called AI explainability, meaning trying to understand the mechanics that are behind the way in which algorithms select what they show you, right? So this is one main core issue, I would say. So the second one is to try to use this data as a test ground to read the political environment at large, meaning online but also offline. So what happens offline is reflected to a large degree, depending on the country, on what we see online, on the data we can get. And this is new data with new time resolution, with new granularity that we are trying to develop into trying to create new metrics of politics, even offline. So this is, I would say, the second core research issue that we tackle. And then there's another kind of research that we do that is more connected what it's traditionally known as opinion dynamics. So trying to understand laws or models for how people form and change their opinion, which has been traditionally a field that it's very much reliant on synthetic populations, meaning thought experiments or fictitious populations that live in computer simulations, right? In which people only take interest, for example, in the emergence of properties of the whole system, such as division, polarization. But what we're trying to do, because we work so much with social media data, is to try to connect simulations, the models, the abstract models, with empirical data, which is a very recent and difficult endeavor, I would say.
In what ways does your research contribute to pressing social issues or challenges?
So from what I mentioned, I think that a few strike out right as very on the eye of the public debate, right? So the question of political segregation and polarization, which is a concern that many people have, particularly regarding this online ecosystem. So this has fueled, as I mentioned, a new generation of research, but also of policymaking and regulation. And in order for this policymaking and regulation to work, to be actionable, it needs to build on metrics, right? So when we say polarization and we are concerned about the rise of polarization, how do we measure if it was greater today than last week, than last month or last year? So this is a very difficult thing to measure, and a thing that it's very much at the heart of societal issues and concerns that we can contribute to with data.
Looks like your research is very current with the current elections, European elections that we've just had, and it plays an important role. But let's now focus on the gap in your specific field. How does your work contribute to specific problems in bridging that gap?
Right. So, for example, this concept I mentioned like a minute ago, right? So polarization. Polarization is very difficult to conceptualize and to operationalize. And a lot of the research that we're used to hearing about and a lot of the thought we are used to listen to in debates comes from conceptualizations and operationalizations that come from the United States, in which people tend to conceptualize politics in the way that best suits that setting, right? So binary party systems, single-dimensional device, so a single ideological cleavage that would explain most of positions of the public in society. So a liberal conservative kind of divide in society. But when you look at other political systems around the world, particularly here in Europe, this is not the case, right? So you need additional ways of additional dimensions, for example, which is what we do in research to try to make sense of the data you're seeing. So what are the dimensions that we need to take into account in the models to explain the data we see from different countries around the world? This is one of the key things that we, through simulation and making the connection between computer science and political science, we try to address with the research. And for this, we have developed quite a lot of models and computational tools that we produce.
What were some of the key findings of your research? And did any of your research results surprise you maybe or challenge existing assumptions?
Going back to this question of polarization, for example, it has had a lot of impact on the way in which people do research on polarization, on how people see the question of misinformation, for example. So for a long time, it was thought that misinformation was mainly driven by ignorance or lack of reflectiveness, right? So people were not careful, people were not reading twice, people were not informed, So this is why, in theory, they were spreading misinformation. But then a new strand of research came about 5 years ago showing that if you start controlling also for the degree of polarization of people and also for these old variables, education, data literacy, reflectiveness, etc., it turns out that polarization plays quite an important role, right? And what's been measured in the United States in these studies from 5 years ago is that the more polarized someone is, the higher the probability that person will be sharing misinformation. And there's a little bit of an asymmetry, right? So the farther polarized towards the conservative side, it would seem to be a little bit more, have more probability of sharing misinformation. So the expectation was that in Europe, this was going to be the same. So we set up rightly to measure this thing on the dimensions that we thought were important in Europe, right? So not only one, but several, depending on the country. And what we observed was that it was the same in Europe, in the two countries in which we conducted our first large study, which is France and Italy, in the sense that people that are more polarized in the left-right political scale, so very to the far right or to the far left, had a high probability of sharing misinformation, but it turned out to be kind of asymmetric, which it's more natural from an explanation from a psychological point of view in which people would try to figure out what polarization means and mechanistically in trying to share this misinformation. What we also show is that when you look at these other dimensions that need to be looked at, for example, some that are not that much correlated with left-right, such as trust in institutions, attitudes towards European Union, etc., a number of dimensions that cannot be reduced to a single one, the picture is quite complex, right? So different regions in political opinion spaces subtended by these kind of dimensions would be taken to account to understand different niches of groups of people with different political beliefs that have different tendencies to sharing or not misinformation.
As you know, in this podcast, we're interested on the impact of the research. And my next question is, how do you make the bridge between your research and real life?
Yeah, this is crucial, right? Because academic research, as any activity, has its logic, right? There's a logic, a mechanism through which people come to be, a way in which careers exist, a way in which articles exist. And this, if not tackled by design, must not necessarily connect very well with reality, right? So it's completely possible that people doing research live in a niche, in an economic niche, that produces careers and articles. So I think it's very healthy for research in general. Not for everyone. It's okay that for research to exist, also isolated from reality too. But not all of research. So for a part of research that needs to be connected for reality, I think that it's healthy to think of it as engaging constantly the actors that have the stakes in reality. So in the case of my research, it's constant communication and collaboration and exchanges with policymakers and regulators, the people that are on the terrain, with the mandate to make this, for example, new regulation on platforms work. So what are the metrics that they are missing? What are the things that they are observing? What are the challenges that they are facing? But this is different for different disciplines and different fields of research, of course.
Can you maybe give me an example of your research translating into real-world applications?
Yeah, so for example, this research we do in trying to understand online politics in Europe across different dimensions, we partnered up with researchers at the Complex Systems Institute in Paris, in which they were conducting a data donation program, meaning that we're asking people to install a plugin on a browser so they could read what the recommender system on different platforms was proposing to them, which is very difficult data to get right. So only platforms typically have this data. So partnering with them, we were able to concretely measure the political diversity of the content that is recommended to people, which is kind of a very rare thing to see. Mostly people in platforms, working platforms, can produce this kind of research. And so with that, we were able to produce a precise measurement of the political diversity of the content you're recommended here in France, which, for example, only people from Meta, for example, have been producing lately in the United States.
That's a very interesting application indeed. Moving on, let's pretend for a second that I'm 20 years old and I want to change the world for the better. And I'm coming to you, Pedro, and I'm asking you, why should I engage in research at all?
What's particular to research is the way in which the people that do research live by. So when you work in a company, you work for the growth of the company. When you work in government, you work for accountability and setting out and reaching out goals that are set by policy. When you're in research, you are within a system that is set out to preserve as much as possible the objectivity of knowledge production, that is disentangled from the dynamics of the economic world around you or the policy world around you to some degree. So this takes very concrete forms. So, for example, the way in which you access research positions through the examination of a committee that has the mission to evaluate you impartially. The way in which peer reviews select the articles that you produce that are eventually published. The way in which you are motivated to render your results public and usable. So a lot of these things set out for a career that is quite unique, right? In which you can really take the time to develop something kind of sheltered from the dynamics around it, which is sometimes a drawback, but for a lot of people a very good opportunity. It's the way in which some of these ideas that need this independence can grow. And this can be very attractive to a kind of way of doing impact in the world. I think it's essential.
All right, now you convinced me I should engage in research, but why should I choose your research topic?
So there are things that are very attractive, and this is the things that draw the people that we hire from. So it's very interdisciplinary. So people are looking at research in sociology and political science, but they're also getting their hands on data. It's very professionalizing. So we process a lot of big data. We do a lot of algorithm. We do a lot of AI. So people that come work in this field are very proficient in a lot of things, which is very interesting for when they decide to do other things later on. But there are also a lot of reasons that I think. There are a lot of reasons by which I think not everyone should come to the research field, of course. So this is a very entangled field between research and politics, right? So a lot of people that come into research come wanting to make an impact in the world. But when you're doing research and producing metrics about politics, you also need some kind of a restraint, right? A way in which keeping a cool-headed about what you're doing and not get your own identity, your own personal desires interfere with what you are producing that is intended to inform policy and regulation, for example. So, and this, when you see young people, for example, coming on and they're making their way into finding their own political identity or other things, this is kind of always a struggle, but every discipline has its struggle. This is the particular struggle for this discipline, maybe I would say.
Great. Any final thoughts on future research directions in your field?
I think the most important thing is that in this field, what comes out is that a lot of the functioning of this modern world should not be taken for granted, right? So we see how important disruptions can change the way in which we live. For example, I think COVID, it's a good illustration of this. So something can really perturb, disrupt the way in which you live. And a lot of the things in which we rely on, the way in which you communicate. So, for example, this morning I was leaving my kids at the daycare center. I wanted to communicate something to my wife. I did it on a Meta platform, right? So a lot of the things that we do rely on things that we take for granted and that are subjected to political dynamics, international relation dynamics that are bound to change and to change drastically. I don't know if in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but systems don't last that much, right? So a lot of the things related to privacy, to the place we grant to the systems in a more public sphere, a lot of these things are bound to change, and we need to understand them better, but also to be kind of informed and prepared for the evolution of these kind of systems and their role in society.
And that wraps up today's episode of the R&D Unplugged podcast. I'm Shahab Nastar, your host. Many thanks to today's guest, Pedro Ramaciotti Morales, for sharing his insights and expertise. A big thank you to all of our listeners. R&D Unplugged is a Learning Planet Institute podcast. This episode was produced by Annalena Neurohr and Shahab Nastar, with recording and editing by Jean-Marc Sevin. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find all of our podcasts and further information about all of our activities on our website at learningplanetinstitute.org/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Learning Planet Institute.